people for turning up today. Lit B is a specification that's really close to my heart. I've been teaching it since the legacy spec for a long time, and feel very strongly that it's a fantastic fantastic specification that offers so much to teachers and students. I'm really grateful to Laura for promoting it in this way, and for asking me to be a part of it. So as I said, my name's Anna. I'm based in Leicester, and because of the upper school system that Leicester historically had, I've pretty much taught Key Stage 5 almost predominantly, certainly exam classes predominantly, for my entire career. So I've got lots to say about A Level. Hopefully some of it will be useful. I think this session is well, it's unique. We think it's pretty much the first of its kind, don't we, Laura? Sort of a session specifically focused on A-level literature teaching, and I can't think of anything more important at the moment. You know, we've got the Education Secretary telling us that English isn't an important subject to study at A-level, that STEM schools are the ones that count, STEM subjects are the ones that count. And I think we have a duty to promote our subject at the moment, because we know how important it is, and we know that once students take it, actually they realise how important it is and how valuable it is. So I feel that there's a moral purpose to what we're doing here today as well, and so I'm delighted to be here. Just to say that I'm actually on holiday, so we'll be shooting off due to COVID-related half-term lockdown situation within our house. So I'll be shooting off after my session, but we'll definitely answer questions on Twitter, and we'll definitely be watching all the other fabulous sessions as they're released later on. Okay, so we'll crack on then. So, oops, there we go. So I wanted to just start with why I love Lit B. And there's a list of things on there, but really it's because it is such a modern specification. It's grounded in students' responses, and it's grounded in their ideas. It doesn't believe that there's one way to write an essay, and it actively promotes quirky responses. It likes, as a specification, it endorses a student's own particular style and voice, and I think that's what A-level teaching is all about. You know, is a removal from the rigidities of GCSE, and this specification in particular pushes that approach. It also really respects deep knowledge of the text, and in that way I think it values the Band 2 responses equally to the Band 5 responses, and there's a real opportunity for students of all abilities to feel successful in this specification, and that's some of the stuff that we'll look at today. The last one, I think, for me, is an important one. It really removes the need for students and teachers to obsess over assessment objectives and to worry about assessment objectives. And it allows us just to focus on answering the question and on dealing with our subject. And I'll spend a bit of time talking about that in a bit, about how that's something that we manage within our school. So I thought I'd start with some extracts from the 2019 report, which is of course the most recent. And I won't presume to read through everything that's on the slide there, but that's all taken sort of directly from the report. And I love that last line: it's stories which fire the imagination of readers, and that's what English literature primarily ought to do. And yes, of course, this is what we want to do as teachers of literature. And I love the fact that in the report it's telling us, focus on the stories, deal with the stories. It's liberating. And I think as teachers we have to hold our nerve a bit here. We've had decades, haven't we, of being told that the story is the easy bit. We shouldn't be teaching the story because that's easy, the content's the easy bit. And actually Lit B acknowledges that these stories that we're teaching at A-level are really complex, that there's subtleties in these intricate narratives that are difficult for students to grasp, and it rewards students that do grasp those subtleties and are able to deal with the entire flow of the story, and to talk about the way in which one event leads into the next, and to understand that that in itself is something quite complex and difficult to do. For example, at Beecham City Sick, at the college that I work at, we spend the first 3 weeks, and you do have to hold your nerve for this, but we spend the first 3 weeks just watching the RSC Othello, really going through it really slowly. So watching a chunk and then explaining to the students what's happened and getting them to talk about what's happened. So at the end of that 3 weeks, we've not done any actual written work, but the students understand the story, they're able to speak clearly about the story, and they can, excuse me, little visitor, they're able to speak fluently about the story and be able to discuss the events that have happened. And therefore, any analysis that follows on after that comes from a position of secure knowledge of the text. And I think that's a really beneficial way into A-level study, understanding that speaking about everything on a structural purpose helps. Okay, so moving on to assessment objectives. Now, I know that there are weightings to assessment objectives at the front of the specification, and we know that there's slight sort of imbalance on there. However, we know from examiner reports and from CPD that AQA run that the assessment objectives are dealt with in a holistic manner. So what that means is Lit B doesn't see how you can separate one from the other. So let's take setting, for example. Say we're talking about setting. Well, that's obviously a method, isn't it? So it's AO2. But if the question's about setting, it's also AO1. And if the setting is linked to the genre and to the context, well, then it's AO3 as well. So, and of course, if you're arguing that the setting does something, then it's AO5. So it's very difficult to separate them out. Therefore, what AQA's advice has been, if we're taking the examiner's report and previous CPD as verbatim, is that we don't really need to worry about, we don't need to worry about the assessment objectives when we're approaching questions. We don't need to worry about the weighting of the assessment objectives. They're marked holistically. We just need to think about answering the question. So let's see how that looks in practice. So you can see there that the question writers are considering the assessment objectives when they put the questions together. Therefore, we don't need to teach the assessment objectives to our students. I mean, this is a personal thing. It's not something that's endorsed, but I don't teach the assessment objectives to my students. I think you could ask them what they were and they wouldn't know, and I'm perfectly happy for that. I don't think it helps them at all to know assessment objectives. I think it's additional cognitive load that adds very little to the way that they read and write about literature. What I tell them is that they need to answer the question. And I think you can see on the slide in front of us that if they're answering the question, they're triggering all the assessment objectives. So I'm thinking about the question in all its parts. Obviously there's the additional, on the to what extent questions, you've got the additional line about method. So the whole thing, but if they're answering the question, then they don't need to worry about those AOs. So if we're not worrying about the assessment objectives, then what should we use if we're thinking about how we mark it and we're thinking about how we guide students to move from one band to the next? Well, I use the descriptors which are at the front of the mark schemes, and I think they're a fantastic ladder for students, and I think they're a brilliant approach to help encourage our kids to write creatively and to think about how they can scaffold their writing, but in a personal manner that doesn't dictate the way it should look. So you can see them on the screen now, and if people don't use their marking, I would really, really recommend it. I think they liberate students, and I think they're much easier for us. I think it speeds up the marking. So that's the approach that I tend to take on there now, and that I do have this up in my classrooms. So I'm just going to take you through what those might look like in practice. So we're going to use this. This is just an extract for Othello that I've used in the past and that I've sort of exemplified. So it's just the conversation between Roderigo and Iago in Act 1 that finishes with Iago's soliloquy, where he's sort of basically having a bit of he's criticising Roderigo for being a bit of an idiot. So band 2 then, if we tell students that they're writing in band 2, it's simple and or generalised. And what I've exemplified here is the simple one. Generalised is a general answer, it's there or thereabouts. But simple is where they say something like this: Iago's a villain because he treats Roderigo really badly, even though he pretends to be his friend. And he says, "Thus do I ever make my fool my purse," which shows that he thinks Roderigo is a fool. And I think a simple takes a simple answer. And I think that's something that students can understand, and they can start to think about how they might develop as a response to that. So the next one, the words for band 3 are relevant and straightforward. Relevant is obviously a really important word. they need to be answering the questions. And personally, I'm quite mean when, well, I don't think it's mean, I think it's the right thing to do, but when students don't answer the question, if it's not relevant, I shove them in band 2, because that's what will happen, I think, to them in the exam. So that to me seems a kind thing to do long term. So let's think about straightforward then. So what I always say to students is, don't underestimate how hard it is to get 15 marks at A level. Like, band 3 is difficult. And the relevant itself is often a barrier. But if we think about the straightforward explanation, if we assume that they're answering the question, let's think about what straightforward does. Well, it's a big jump from band 2, isn't it? We've just talked about band 2 being very simple, where they sort of repeat what they've said. Band 3, I think, we're starting to think about sort of that straightforward explanation about how he treats him differently. And you can see the bits that we've added in there. He's fooled by Iago because he thinks he cares about him, but he doesn't, because he's using insults. So there's quite a lot more going on here. And I think for students, if we're telling them a straightforward explanation is doing more than simply repeating it, it's explaining it, but it's in their own personal voice and style, then I don't think this is an easy thing to do. And I don't think students can expect to go band 2, band 3, band 4 from essay to essay to essay. I think they tend to spend a bit of time getting their band 3 writing right. And I think that's okay. Okay, so as we move into band 4, the key word that I tend to use is thorough. Such a great word to help students, and obviously coherent as well. And so if students have a tendency to write in a way that isn't clear, then it's difficult for them to get into band 4. And so spending that time working on their writing in band 3, the clarity of their writing is worth it in spades. But thorough, if we're talking about thorough development, well, I often say to my kids, it looks a bit different. You'll tend to write a bit more in a thorough paragraph, so it will look a bit fatter on the page, and that's something I tend to suggest. And I think one thing I would suggest here is look at the use of sort of adjectives and adverbs for analysis. That tends to be a sign of thorough writing. So, or even the verbs itself here, we've got that coaxing him out of his lovelorn suicidal thoughts. So that phrase there, which is sort of halfway down the page, that the way in which the verb coaxing has been used, that's analysis itself. We don't need them to do point, evidence, explain, blah, blah, blah. That's analytical. They're talking about it in a dramatic fashion, and that additional adjective there, that lovelorn suicidal thoughts, that's better than just suicidal thoughts. And we're not asking for sort of purple prose or sort of floral writing, but using adjectives, adverbs very precisely and very specifically is a very good way to be thorough, is a very good way for them to develop their answer. And you can see there's quite a few examples of it here. Extortion and abuse, you know, the sort of the phrasing of it is efficient, but it's certainly analytical. And that's something that I tend to say to my kids to help them get into band 4 without telling them how to write. So band 5, I've often heard people talk about perceptive, and people often say it's the thing that you can't describe. Perceptive's the sort of it's the, people say it's the, you know, it's something that you can just do or you can't do, and I don't really buy into that. I think we can absolutely teach kids to be perceptive. It's what's chosen to be written about, so they can have a perceptive understanding of the text and make perceptive choices. So their choices themselves are a good way into perceptive. Assurance is how it's said. So assurance is their style, and that both those things, those perceptive choices and an assured style, I believe, comes from real confidence in the text. So they have to know the text incredibly well to be both perceptive and assured. They've got to graft. I think perceptive and assurance comes from graft. It doesn't come from some talent that we can't describe or we can't pin down. It comes from hard work, and I think we can see examples of it here. Look at the sort of the judicious use of precise adjectives that have added in, that so it's in bolds, the extra bits. So you've got that calculated verse. It's not just verse, it's calculated, and it's sort of that structural understanding. His abuse and then support of Othello at the start of Act 1 is repeated in reverse. So they know the play well enough to be able to see that those two things are happening in a different pattern. It's not particularly sophisticated observation, but it's perceptive because it comes from that exceptional knowledge of the text. So that's how I tend to encourage my students to move themselves through the mark scheme. So I hope that's useful. So what we're going to do now is going to move on to 3 great answers. I've got a gratuitous picture of a cross-looking cat there. And we're going to think about what they all have in common. What I won't do is presume to read all 3 of them out loud. I'll let you have a little scan, and I'll sort of talk through as we're going through. The first one is from one of my students, and the other 2 are from the secure key material. So we can see on here, I'm sure, I know people are reading at the same time, that this student is really interested in method. This is a really AO2 heavy answer, and that's how he's approached it. He's thought about dramatic method, he's thought about narrative method as well, I think there, and he's really thought about how he can discuss the ways in which Shakespeare creates effect. And you can see it's dense with it, you can see it all the way through. Again, I think that use of academic vocabulary is really clever here too. Draws allegiance, he says, making an alliance with Roderigo. And I think those sort of words show that this student, there's some real subtle contextual understanding there as well. He's writing about the military context without explicitly doing it. So this student has accessed the top band by thinking very much about method. That's what this student is interested in. This next one is a bit of a Marmite response. When we've used it in school discussion before, teachers in our department anyway, teachers either love it or hate it. But I'll let you have a little look at it. So this student is journalistic. This isn't like, it doesn't look like a traditional academic essay. And we know that this is a standardized response from EAQA. So we know that this was a standardized band 5 response. But look at the way that the student describes things. This motive is just so small fry, they say. And at the end, Iago is definitely fiendish. Perhaps fiendish isn't strong enough. He's monstrous and evil. He doesn't evoke hell and night for nothing. I mean, you can hear this kid's voice, can't you? This is an engaged, enthusiastic kid brimming with a feisty opinions. You know, it's great to read, but it's very, very different to the previous one. It's a journalistic response. And then the last one, from a sophisticated place. So another band 5 response, very, very different to the previous 2. So this is an approach that I tend to use in my classroom. I will put these type of different responses in front of students so they can find the response that suits them, that fits their style for the best. And we'll also talk about what they all have in common. Cat's back again. They're all different, very, very different, but they're all equally great, and they're all examples of band 5 writing, although the first one is my own marking, so not standardized. But you can see there that they're confident, that they've got fantastic textual knowledge, that they've got their own individual style and voice. And I think it can be quite empowering for students to see these different approaches to writing, all getting rewarded as many marks, because it helps them see that they don't have to mimic my style of writing or some other style of writing. They can do as best fits them. So what advice do we give then? Because obviously they need advice. They need to be taught how to be A-level students. What advice do we give them that doesn't stifle creativity and or their own personal style? So these are a list of things that I would tend to share. They're on the board now. I think topic sentences are a gift. Get students, once they understand how to write a topic sentence, I think that transforms their writing. It's often the best way into band 3 and beyond, of course. I'm a big fan of teaching them to use adjectives and adverbs, and I don't mean in excess. We're not looking for purple prose, but using them to analyse, I think can be very effective. They certainly shouldn't be afraid to say I. It's an exam response, they're working under pressure. It's absolutely fine for them to say I, and it's fine for them to have their own opinion as long as they can back it up. You certainly won't find me saying there's no wrong answer in English. I don't believe that, but I do believe that they can have different opinions about text, and as long as it can be backed up, that's fine. I would also say, don't just exemplify band 5. I spend quite a bit of time exemplifying band 3. Show them what a good band 3 response looks like, because it is a bridging band. It's the basis for everything. Get them writing good band 3 essays and the rest will follow. Okay, so just an example from another student. You can see all those tips in practice. You've got the great topic sentence at the start. You've got some of those really clever adjectives being employed there. We've got the rightful anger, and the inadequate work of Van Horn, so the students sort of evaluating as they're going along. And then that evaluative sentence at the end, therefore the absence of the murderer serves to criminalise the police and present them in a way that may juxtapose a reader's expectations. We can see how that links to the topic sentence as well, so the whole thing holds together. So I thought that's quite a good paragraph from a student that shows how all those different features can operate within a piece of a student's writing. Okay, so moving on then to thinking about word level analysis, the second thing. It's much easier to show perception and to be assured, much easier when you're talking about structure, voice or setting. So thinking about why that might be. Well, I'm going to exemplify this with students' answers, but obviously we haven't got time to look at all of them in detail, but they'll be up on the board so you can see the sort of things that happen. This is an unseen response. And you can see that this student is thinking that they want to talk about structure here. Khan then disrupts the chronological and linear narrative structure through a flashback to one of Chopra and Homi's most famous cases. And then she goes on to think about this in some really quite clever detail. If you look at some of the words that she uses, the heavy delay, she thinks about that sort of example of retardation, where she delays he delays the approach towards the revelation at the end. She talks about this being a detour, about the contrast between this and the main story that's happening, and it is almost naturally becomes perceptive because the nature of what she's speaking in more detail on your own, but it's a fantastic example of how everything can hold together and how you can access perceptive writing when you're thinking about the way in which something's organized. Now, thinking about voice next, this next student's writing about Cassio, and I wanted to use a play because we sometimes think of voice as being only associated with poems and books, sort of narrative voice, but we can definitely talk about character voice as well, which is important for our spec when so much of it is assessed on plays. And she talks about his boyish pleas, which she talks about how his voice could be perceived as irritating or overly belligerent. But she then goes on to say that for her, that actually heightens pity. We pity him because despite his humiliation and self-destruction, he works hard to right his wrongs. So she thinks about the way in which he's presented, the way in which his voice is used, and uses that to come up with her own opinion. And it's much more interesting than just picking out the words he uses. It's much more sophisticated. She's talking about breadth as opposed to just picking out the one word that he might use and stating what that might mean. And then finally, we're going to just have a look at setting. This is another unseen crime. And you can see where this student's gone with this. It's in response to Denise Mina, and she's talking about how the featureless and characterless nature of a long, wide street. And she ranges around the whole extract that she's given there, because she picks out all the different ways in which the setting's presented, coming, as you can see at the end, to even thinking about a tin of sweets that's inside the car and how that emphasizes everything. So again, the way in which she writes, it encourages a ranging response, and it encourages her to respond to writers' choices. So those three aspects, structure, voice and setting, if we can encourage our students to write about those in their own way, we know that they're going to access the top bands. So coming towards the end, 3 minutes, I'll just about make it, I think. If we're going to tell students that there's no one way to write, then and if we're going to encourage them to find their own academic voice, then we need to demonstrate this through our curriculum choices. And I believe that a truly diverse and representative curriculum benefits every single child in the room. And I think if we can expose them to an anti-racist curriculum, that the choices will result in students writing, that their choices will be better, their writing will improve. I think it's a win-win. Benny Cara writes about this beautifully in her book, the little book on diversity. And there really are plenty of opportunities for diversity in Lit B teaching as well, plenty. So I'm going to show you just now some fantastic choices that I've used in case there's something that's useful for you now. I recommend every single one of these. The extract that we looked at earlier on the police the response to an extract earlier was on the police was from Bluebird. The Maria Devana Headley Beowulf is amazing. If you take anything away from this session, that recommendation for that book is fantastic for a feminist text for students to look at for the NEA. The Dark Fantastic is, I think, the best piece of writing you can put in front of kids for post-colonial NEA. The students, they gobble it up. They're so interested in it, and it makes sense to them. They get it. These are all texts that I've used for Unseen, or Gym Patrol and The Long Job were both for Unseen. They worked really well. Loving Colour we used for narrative theory. So when you were teaching narrative theory for the NEA, we did it based on one of the short stories from there, which the students really enjoyed, and it meant we were able to explore it in a bit of detail. Obviously they wouldn't be able to write about just one short story. That was just for exemplification processes. And then finally, some books that I've encouraged either side there. So The Lonely Londoners is fantastic again for post-colonial, so interesting in terms of the way in which dialect is used there. It's also great for narrative theory as well. I've got a student doing narrative theory based on it this year. Firekeeper's Daughter was a fantastic story. Again, another recommendation, read this book, it's so good, and brilliant for an extract for the Unseen. The kids really enjoyed that one and then went away to read it. And The Book in the Middle, really interesting take on eco-theory, and I've used some extracts from that this year that again the students have found super interesting. Okay, so to very last slide, I can't believe I've managed to, almost very last slide, there's just some poetry that we've been using there. I don't know if anybody else has read Portable Paradise by Roger Robinson, but it's fantastic and accessible for GCSE as well, I think, really good. And then as I was leaving, I thought I'd just put up an example of a personal voice that I particularly enjoy, a student who, in contrast to the one we saw earlier, absolutely cannot stand Cassio and writes quite passionately about why she thinks he's a rogue and a rotter, and I thought it might be quite interesting to finish on that real sense of voice. But as I said, I'll share this on Twitter so you can look at these extracts in detail if you want to at a later date. And I will finish there just to say thanks again to Laura for organising, and to everybody else for speaking as well. And thanks for having me.
Thank you so much, Anna. Hopefully everyone can hear me. That was amazing. I've taken so many notes. You know that I always say to you that I worry about the marking of A Level. That going through all the bands at the start was just so helpful. I think it's Richard next. So Richard, if you wanna, I've made you a host. If you want to start sharing your screen. But thank you so much, Anna. Genuinely, and I mean, enjoy the rest of your holiday.
Oh, thank you.
Break.
I definitely will.
There's been some lovely things said on Twitter, which I'm sure you'll see soon. So thank you so much. Right, Richard, are you loaded up?
I am, and I'm hopefully unmuted now.
You are.
Good.